The old pickup skidded across the icy gravel just as a frightened little girl stumbled into the road, clutching the hand of a boy half her size. Thomas Walker slammed the brakes, jumped from the cab, and caught both children before they fell beneath a livestock trailer rumbling past. The smaller boy buried his face against the girl's worn coat. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "It's all right. I've got you." The girl's boots were split at the toes, and the thin sleeves of her sweater could not hide how badly she shivered. Yet instead of asking for help, she wrapped both arms around the younger child, making sure he stayed warm first. Thomas had seen hungry calves, abandoned horses, and lonely winters across Montana, but something about that quiet act settled deep inside him. The woman from the orphan home hurried over, apologizing as she gathered the children together. She explained that the younger ones had become excited after hearing the town auction nearby and slipped through the open gate. The girl had chased after them before anyone else could react. Thomas nodded without saying much. He had only come into town to sell a few head of cattle and leave before sunset. These days he preferred the company of his horses to the conversations of strangers. Ever since Sarah had died 3 years earlier, silence had become the loudest thing waiting for him every evening back at the ranch. Still, instead of climbing back into his truck, he found himself carrying 2 boxes of canned food and warm blankets through the orphan home's front door. The building was clean but tired. Old paint peeled from the walls. Children's drawings covered cracked windows to keep out the winter draft. There was never enough money, yet somehow someone had managed to make the place feel gentle. The little girl from the road was kneeling beside another child, patiently tying his untangled bootlaces. Only after every smaller child had received lunch did she quietly accept a bowl for herself. Thomas noticed she bowed her head before eating, just as Sarah always had. When the meal was over, she walked over to thank him for the supplies. Her voice was soft but steady. "Sir." Thomas looked down. "Do you think everyone deserves a home?" For a long moment, he forgot where he was. Sarah had once asked him almost the very same question while they stood on the porch watching a summer storm roll across the valley. He had laughed back then, never imagining she would leave this world before either of them had the chance to raise a family together. "I hope they do," he finally answered. The girl smiled, not because she believed him, but because she wanted to. "My name is Lily." "Thomas." She nodded politely. "I'll remember." If you've ever wondered whether one small kindness can change 2 lives instead of one, stay with me. Some promises don't begin with words. They begin with a stranger deciding not to walk away. As Thomas stepped back outside, the winter air carried the distant sound of an engine slowing near the orphanage gate. A polished black truck rolled to a stop, and the man climbing out wasn't looking at the children. He was looking at the land beyond them, as if he were already deciding what it would someday be worth. Thomas drove back to the Walker Ranch before dawn, but the little girl's question refused to stay behind in town. Every fence he passed reminded him of the promise he had made to Sarah years earlier. She had once told him that a house became a home only when someone who needed love found it waiting inside. Since her passing, every room had echoed with silence instead. For the next several weeks, Thomas found excuses to deliver feed, blankets, and fresh beef to the orphanage whenever he came into town. He never stayed long. He simply unloaded the supplies, tipped his hat, and left. Yet every visit ended the same way. Lily was helping someone else before she helped herself. She carried smaller children when they were tired, divided her dessert into tiny pieces, and somehow smiled as though kindness cost nothing. One afternoon, Thomas found her sitting alone on the front steps, carefully mending a stuffed rabbit with thick sewing thread. "You fixing that for yourself?" he asked. She shook her head. "It belongs to Emily. She cries without it." Thomas studied the worn toy before quietly handing it back. "You got steady hands." "I've had lots of practice fixing broken things." Those words followed him all the way home. That evening, old Joe noticed Thomas eating dinner without touching most of the food. "You look like you're arguing with Ghost again," the old ranch manager muttered. Thomas managed the faintest smile. Maybe I am. Old Joe waited. Finally, Thomas spoke. What would folks think if an old cowboy brought a 10-year-old girl home? Joe leaned back in his chair. Folks always think something. Doesn't mean they're right. Weeks later, after more conversations with the orphanage director, county officials, and more paperwork than Thomas had expected, the adoption was approved. The news spread across the small Montana town faster than a prairie fire. At the diner, people whispered over their coffee. He's almost 60. Never raised a child. That ranch barely keeps going now. What kind of future can he offer? Thomas ignored every word. On the morning Lily arrived, she stepped from the truck carrying only a small suitcase and the patched rabbit tucked beneath one arm. She stopped in front of the weathered ranch house. So, this is home. Thomas nodded once. If you'll have it. She looked at him with uncertain eyes. I've never had one before. He opened the front door. Then we'd better learn together. The first weeks tested both of them. Lily insisted on helping with every chore. She rose before sunrise, fed chickens with more enthusiasm than experience, and followed Thomas everywhere across the property. On her third attempt at riding, she slipped from the saddle into a pile of hay. She climbed back up before Thomas could reach her. I'm fine. The following week, an impatient young steer bumped her hard enough to knock her backward into the dirt. She brushed herself off, embarrassed more than hurt. I'm still fine. A few days later, she accidentally left the pasture gate unlatched. Half the herd wandered into old Joe's vegetable patch, destroying months of work before anyone noticed. Lily stood beside the broken fence, fighting tears. I'm sorry. I'll probably ruin everything. Thomas picked up a hammer and placed it gently into her hands. Then help me fix it. She blinked. Aren't you angry? He began replacing the first fence post. Everybody makes mistakes. He drove another nail. What matters? He looked at her for the first time that afternoon. That is that you learn from them. Together they rebuilt the fence until sunset painted the sky in soft shades of orange. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. That evening, Lily paused in the kitchen doorway while Thomas prepared a simple pot of beef stew. 2 bowls sat on the table. For us? She asked. Thomas nodded. Seems that way. She smiled so quietly that he almost missed it. For the first time since Sarah's passing, another laugh drifted to the old ranch house. It was small, uncertain, fragile, but it filled every empty room. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep beneath one of Sarah's handmade quilts, Thomas quietly placed his late wife's framed photograph back onto the mantel. I reckon you'd approve, he whispered. Outside, the ranch dog suddenly began barking toward the front gate. Old Joe stepped onto the porch with his lantern raised. Far down the road, a pair of headlights slowed, then stopped, watching the Walker Ranch far longer than any passing traveler should have. 5 years passed, then 10, until 15 seasons had quietly shaped both the ranch and the little girl who had once arrived with nothing but a worn suitcase and a patched rabbit. The fences stood straighter, the barns looked brighter, and laughter no longer sounded like a stranger inside the Walker home. Lily grew alongside the land itself. She learned to saddle horses before sunrise, bottle feed weak calves through cold spring nights, drive the old tractor without stalling, and keep the ranch books balanced after supper. Every evening, no matter how hard the day's work had been, she and Thomas shared dinner at the same wooden table. It became less of a habit than a promise. Thomas never filled the house with long speeches. He believed lessons belonged in everyday work. Whenever a storm rolled across the pasture, he checked the oldest cattle first. Whenever a horse came back lame, he stayed in the barn until the animals settled. One evening, Lily asked why he always chose the hardest path. Thomas rested his weathered hands on the fence rail. Money comes and goes. She waited. Your word stays. Lose that, and you lose yourself. Those simple sentences stayed with her far longer than any school lesson ever would. By the time Lily graduated from high school, everyone in the county knew she possessed a sharp mind and an uncommon work ethic. Her grades earned her a scholarship to study agricultural management and veterinary science. It covered much of the tuition, but not everything. Thomas never mentioned the missing cost. Instead, one crisp autumn morning, he quietly loaded 6 of his finest breeding cattle onto a trailer and drove them to auction. Old Joe recognized every animal. Those are Sarah's favorites. Thomas gave a slow nod. I know. You don't have to do this. I do. When he returned home that evening, the trailer stood empty. Lily immediately understood. You sold them. They'll help pay the rest. Her eyes filled with tears. You love those cattle. Thomas shrugged as if the sacrifice meant very little. Cattle can be raised again. He looked toward the fading sunset. Opportunity can't. Lily hugged him before he could step away. Thomas awkwardly patted her shoulder, still uncomfortable receiving affection even after all those years. Yet when she finally let go, he smiled in the quiet way Sarah had once loved. College changed Lily, but not the values she carried from home. She learned modern breeding methods, livestock nutrition, pasture rotation, veterinary medicine, and business management. Professors praised her practical instincts because every lesson reminded her of something Thomas had already taught with his hands instead of words. Meanwhile, life on the Walker Ranch grew harder. Thomas's back stiffened every winter morning. Arthritis crept into his hands until fastening saddle straps sometimes took twice as long. More than once old Joe caught him pausing against a barn wall after lifting heavy feed sacks. You ought to let Lily know. Thomas shook his head. She's building her future. You are her future. Thomas pretended not to hear. When Lily called from college, he always sounded cheerful. Everything's fine here. The herd? Healthy. You? Too stubborn to quit. He never mentioned the sleepless nights, the aching joints, or the pills hidden inside the kitchen cupboard. Not everyone wished the Walker Ranch well. Just beyond the eastern fence line stretched Crawford Ranch, owned by Ben Crawford, whose operation had expanded year after year until it seemed to swallow neighboring properties like slow-moving wildfire. Ben arrived one afternoon in a spotless pickup that looked strangely out of place beside Thomas's dusty corrals. He removed his expensive hat with practiced politeness. Afternoon, Tom. Thomas continued repairing a gate without looking up. What brings you here? I've got another offer. I'm not selling. You haven't heard the number. I don't need to. Ben smiled the way businessmen smiled before closing traps. Your land connects everything I own. Then you'll have to keep owning 2 separate pieces. Ben chuckled softly. Pride can be expensive. Thomas finally met his eyes. So can greed. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Ben climbed back into his truck. Before closing the door, he delivered one final sentence in an almost friendly voice. There'll come a day when you won't have another choice. Dust rolled behind his tires as he drove away. Old Joe watched from the porch. I don't like the sound of that. Thomas rested both hands on the fence. Neither do I. That evening, after finishing chores, Thomas walked alone to the small hill where Sarah rested beneath a weathered headstone overlooking the ranch. I kept my promise, he whispered. The place is still standing. He paused before adding quietly, and Lily's becoming everything we hoped a child could be. A cold breeze crossed the prairie. Far below, the lights from Crawford Ranch glowed brighter than ever. Thomas could not know that Ben had already begun speaking with the local bank. He wasn't waiting for Thomas to change his mind anymore. He was waiting for time to do the persuading. The drought arrived without mercy. Week after week, the Montana sky stayed painfully clear. Grass withered into brittle straw beneath the summer sun. Water levels dropped until cattle crowded around shrinking ponds, searching for relief that never came. Feed prices climbed. Beef prices fell. Every decision Thomas made seemed to cost more than it saved. The Walker Ranch had survived blizzards, floods, and harsh winters. It had never faced a season quite like this. Emma, the local bank manager, sat quietly across from Thomas in her office, a thick folder resting between them. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "The payment is due next month, if the loan isn't brought current." Thomas finished the sentence for her. "The bank begins foreclosure." Emma lowered her eyes. "I've tried to buy you more time." "I know." She slid another paper across the desk. "Someone has already expressed interest in purchasing the property if it becomes available." Thomas didn't need to read the name. Ben Crawford. Emma answered with silence. Outside the bank, Ben leaned comfortably against his polished truck. "Morning, Tom." Thomas kept walking. "You've always loved that ranch," Ben continued. "I'd hate to see strangers own it." "It won't happen." Ben smiled. "Sometimes a man doesn't lose because he's weak." Thomas stopped. "He loses because time finally catches him." Thomas climbed into his pickup without another word, but for the first time in years, doubt rode home beside him. The following month, before sunrise, Thomas entered the calving barn alone. One frightened heifer had gone into labor during the night, and he refused to leave the work to Old Joe. He guided the exhausted animal through the difficult birth, lifting the newborn calf onto fresh straw. The calf finally breathed. Thomas smiled. Then a crushing pain exploded across his chest. The pitchfork slipped from his hands. He reached for the stall door, but found only empty air. His knees struck the dirt floor. Old Joe heard the fall from outside. "Tom." By the time the ambulance reached the ranch, Thomas could barely speak. His only words were almost a whisper. "Take care of the cattle." The hospital room smelled of antiseptic instead of hay. The cardiologist folded his hands. "You were fortunate." Thomas managed a weak smile. "I don't feel fortunate. You suffered a serious heart attack." The doctor's expression hardened. "If you continue working the ranch the way you have been..." He paused. "The next one may kill you." Thomas stared through the window, toward the mountains. "I don't know how to stop." "You may not have a choice." Hundreds of miles away, Lily's phone rang just before dawn. Old Joe rarely called. When she answered, she immediately heard fear in his voice. "You need to come home." She was already packing before the conversation ended. Her supervisor found her clearing her desk. "You're leaving?" "My father needs me." "What about the promotion?" Lily looked toward the window for only a moment. "I wouldn't have this career without him." She drove through the night. The familiar entrance to Walker Ranch came into view just as the sun climbed above the hills. Everything looked smaller than she remembered. Everything looked older. Thomas looked older, too. His shoulders had narrowed. His hands trembled slightly. Even standing seemed to require effort. He tried to smile. "You should have stayed." She embraced him before he could step back. "You spent 15 years building my future." She looked into his tired eyes. "It's my turn to protect yours." Thomas shook his head. "You deserve your own life." She squeezed his hand. "You gave me that life, so don't throw it away." "I'm not." She smiled through tears. "I'm bringing it home." The next morning, Lily walked through every corner of the ranch with a notebook in hand. She counted machinery. Half of it needed replacing. She inspected the barns. Several roofs leaked. She reviewed feed contracts. Most expired within weeks. Then she opened the financial ledgers. Her expression slowly changed. Outstanding loans. Overdue equipment payments. Falling cattle prices. Medical bills Thomas had hidden. She sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. You carried all this alone. Old Joe nodded. He wouldn't let us tell you. Why? He wanted you chasing dreams. She closed the ledger gently, and nearly lost his own. Emma arrived that afternoon with official documents. I delayed this as long as I could. She placed the foreclosure notice on the kitchen table. The bank has no legal choice now. Thomas lowered his head. I understand. Lily picked up every page, reading each line carefully. When? 30 days. And if we repay the debt before then, the foreclosure is withdrawn immediately. Lily nodded once. Then we're not finished. Emma looked at her with cautious hope. No. Lily folded the papers. We're just getting started. Ben Crawford appeared before sunset. This time, he didn't bother pretending friendship. He removed a purchase contract from a leather briefcase. I'll make this easy. Thomas remained silent. Ben looked toward Lily. You must be the daughter. I am. You've studied business, haven't you? I have. Then you understand numbers. He tapped the contract. The ranch is finished. Lily didn't even glance at the papers. You seem awfully certain. I've watched this place decline for years. My father kept it alive. For a while. Ben smiled cynically. You can't save sentiment with spreadsheets. Lily met his gaze without raising her voice. And you can't buy integrity. Ben's smile faded. The bank doesn't collect integrity. No. Lily answered. But customers do. For the first time, Ben seemed uncertain. Only for a heartbeat. Then he climbed back into his truck. As the engine started, he delivered one final warning through the open window. When the deadline comes, that I'll be waiting. Dust rose behind him until the truck disappeared beyond the hill. Lily watched it vanish. Then she turned back toward the weathered ranch house, toward the aging barn, toward the fields Thomas had protected for decades. She wasn't looking at a failing business. She was looking at a family worth fighting for. And before sunrise the next morning, she had already begun drawing up a plan that would either save everything Thomas had built, or lose it forever. Before the first light touched the pastures, Lily was already walking the ranch with a notebook in one hand and Thomas's old coffee mug in the other. She wasn't searching for what had been lost. She was searching for what could still be saved. The next several months became the hardest work either Walker had ever known. Lily reorganized the cattle program, selling animals that no longer produced, well, while protecting the strongest bloodlines Thomas had spent decades building. She introduced rotational grazing to restore exhausted fields, modernized health records, and began offering direct sales to local families instead of relying entirely on livestock auctions. She even persuaded a neighboring processor to help launch a small Walker ranch beef label built on honesty rather than volume. When people asked why they should trust an old ranch fighting bankruptcy, Lily answered with complete transparency. She opened the books. She invited customers to tour the ranch. She showed healthy cattle instead of polished advertisements. Slowly, trust returned. Ben Crawford noticed. His first response was quiet. His second was ruthless. Rumors spread across town that Walker cattle were unhealthy. a long-time restaurant suddenly canceled its order without explanation. One supplier claimed Lily had missed payments that had actually been made weeks earlier. Old Joe slammed his hat onto the kitchen table. "He's trying to starve us." Lily remained calm. "Then we don't fight rumors." She gathered invoices, veterinary reports, inspection records, and signed delivery receipts. "We fight with the truth." Emma helped verify every financial record. Local ranchers who had once doubted Thomas began speaking publicly about the honesty that had defined Walker Ranch for decades. When the false accusations collapsed under documented evidence, the canceled customers quietly returned. This time they brought new ones with them. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning the old equipment shed, Old Joe carried a weathered wooden box into the house. "I reckon it's time." Lily brushed away years of dust before lifting the lid. Inside rested neatly folded receipts, loan papers, a faded journal, and one familiar photograph of Sarah smiling beside Thomas. She unfolded the oldest receipt first. Sale of 12 quarter horses. She frowned. These were his favorites. Old Joe nodded. He sold every one. Another document revealed a personal loan. Another listed tuition payments. Another showed veterinary school expenses. Every sacrifice carried Thomas's signature. Near the bottom lay Sarah's journal. Lily carefully opened the worn pages. One sentence had been underlined years before. "If we are ever blessed with child, I hope they never measure love by what we keep, only by what we gladly give away." Lily closed the journal as tears finally escaped. For years she had believed Thomas merely supported her education. She now understood the truth. He had quietly surrendered almost everything he loved to make sure she never had to surrender her future. That evening she sat beside his hospital bed. Thomas noticed the old journal resting in her lap. "So, Joe finally found it." She nodded. "You sold Sarah's horses." "They were only horses." "You mortgaged the ranch." "We managed." "You skipped medical appointments." Thomas smiled weakly. "I've always been stubborn." Lily reached for his hand. "No." Her voice trembled. "You've always been my father." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words had finally become too small for everything they meant. Only weeks later, the turning point arrived. A regional grocery chain, impressed by Walker Ranch's transparency and animal care standards, signed a long-term supply agreement large enough to stabilize the business. Revenue climbed. Outstanding debts disappeared one payment at a time. Emma personally delivered the final release papers. She smiled as she handed them to Thomas. "I've waited a long time to say this." Thomas looked at the document. The foreclosure had been withdrawn. Walker Ranch belonged to the Walker family, alone once again. Ben Crawford never returned with another offer. Without rumors to hide behind and without a failing ranch to exploit, he quietly turned his attention elsewhere. One autumn morning, Lily surprised Thomas by leading him toward the old farmhouse garden. Flowers bloomed where weeds had once taken over. Sarah's favorite white roses stood beside fresh lavender. The porch had been repaired. The faded paint had been restored. Inside the living room, Sarah's portrait once again overlooked the fireplace. Thomas removed his hat. "I never thought I'd see it like this again." Lily smiled. "It always belonged to all of us." Several months later, Thomas signed the official documents placing day-to-day management of Walker Ranch into Lily's hands. He looked across the pastures before speaking. This place was never just land. His eyes rested on Lily. It was always meant to grow good people. Years passed. Walker Ranch became known not only for its cattle, but for something far more valuable. Every year, Lily funded scholarships for children who had grown up without families. She created apprenticeships for young people who wanted to learn honest ranch work. No child who needed a chance was turned away without being heard. Then, one cool spring afternoon, a nervous little boy stood outside the front gate, holding a worn backpack almost too big for his shoulders. He looked at Lily with uncertain eyes. "Nam." She knelt so they were eye to eye. "Yes." "Do you think I could stay here?" For just a heartbeat, she saw another frightened child standing on the orphanage steps 15 years earlier. She smiled through grateful tears. Everyone makes mistakes. The boy looked confused. She gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "You learn from them." Then she opened the gate. "But here, you'll always have a home." From the porch, Thomas, his hair now completely white, watched children laughing as they ran across the same fields he had once believed would die with him. Beside his rocking chair rested Sarah's photograph. He smiled softly toward the setting sun. The promise he had made to his wife had not ended with saving a ranch. It had become a family. And that family had become a legacy. If this story reminded you that the greatest inheritance isn't land or money, but the kindness we leave in someone else's life, share where you're watching from in the comments. Until next time, may your door always remain open for someone who needs a place to call home.